All right, so yes, recent research using some of Kevin King's Edge-of-Field data. And we're trying to answer this question: what's more important for water quality, recently applied P or legacy soil P? And this is a question that a lot of people have different answers for. Laura gave us her answer earlier today, and I'm just going to share what the Edge-of-Field data tell us about this question. So this is all derived from the fact that we can separate agricultural P runoff into two sources. So it can either come from newly applied P. So this is often called incidental P or episodic P loss. And these are recently applied phosphorus, essentially is what that is. And these manifest as short-term spikes within a few weeks or months after the P application. The other source is legacy soil P, and this is often termed chronic loss. And this is P also from P applications, but in the past. So historic P applications that are now stored in the soil phosphorus pools. And this is usually manifests as persistent losses over a long period of time. Okay, so from the literature, we know that new P can be a significant source of phosphorus in runoff, several pounds from a given application. Some research shows that. However, there's some work that Kevin published with some other people in this room in 2017 that suggests legacy P is a pretty significant contributor from Northwest Ohio, at least. However, we don't really know, we haven't really quantified the relative contributions of this new P source and the legacy P source. And we also don't know how important fertilizer management is. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, trying to quantify this, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about different fertilizer management options and what our data says about those. Okay, so most of you have probably seen some variation of this slide. This is the Edge-of-Field network that Kevin manages. It was established between 2012 to 2017. There's 40 different fields in the network, and it was really designed to examine different management practices such as fertilizer management, cover crops, etc. So we measure both surface runoff and tile drainage. There's automated water samplers and flow meters. I'm not going to get into the details of all that. I did want to highlight a few relevant findings from this network. This is from previous analyses, but we know that phosphorus concentrations are greater in surface runoff. This is probably not a big surprise to most of you. However, 80% of the volume of discharge from these fields passes through the tile lines. So as Laura was talking about earlier, load is the product of both concentration and discharge. So in the end, what we see is that about 2/3 of the P load is transmitted through tile drains in this network, and about 1/3 of it goes through surface runoff. And we know that both dissolved reactive P and total P are important in both pathways. So sometimes I hear people, say that surface runoff, you get all the total phosphorus, and through the tile lines, you only get dissolved phosphorus. But that's not the case. We see both forms in both pathways. Okay, so getting back to this new P versus legacy P. The question is, how can we distinguish between these two? And so the simple way you might think would be, just look at a P application, measure how much P is coming off that field right after that application, and that's your answer. That's how much P you can attribute to that application. However, if you think about it a little bit more deeply, you'll realize that that's an overestimation. Because if you hadn't applied that P in the first place, you still would see some phosphorus leaving that field. And that's coming from the legacy phosphorus source, right? So what we have to do is somehow separate those two sources during that period after a P application. And that's essentially what I've done in this analysis. So after a P application, so I'm looking at a 3-month risk period. So I'm really focused on 3 months after a given phosphorus application. And what I do is I predict the expected legacy phosphorus concentration during that period. Okay? And I do that using data from the legacy periods, so from the periods where we had no phosphorus applications. And based on that concentration, I can then calculate the expected legacy phosphorus load for those 3-month periods. And then all I do is I basically just subtract the expected load, the expected legacy load from what we actually observed. Okay, so anything above what we expected to see from a legacy source, we would then attribute to the phosphorus application, the fertilizer application. Okay, so that's just here in equation form. And so we also lump that expected legacy phosphorus load into the total legacy load. Okay, if that makes sense, hopefully. All right, so I have an example here. So if it's not clear yet, hopefully this helps clarify things. So essentially this graph is showing the cumulative load of phosphorus. This is a DRP in this case, but the cumulative load for 3 months after a phosphorus application. So in this case, the application happened on June 1st, and we monitor the DRP coming off that field for the next 3 months. Okay? The orange bar here is what we actually observed coming off of that field. Okay? You can see a big jump right away, and then it sort of tapers off. The blue line here is showing what we expected. So this is what I predicted the legacy loss would have been if that phosphorus application had never occurred. Does that make sense? So here we have an observed load of 0.1 pounds of DRP. The expected load was 0.01 pounds. Okay? So the extra P that came off above this expected legacy loss, that's what we're going to consider new phosphorus. Okay? So here we have it. 0.1 minus 0.01, so it's about 0.106 pounds for this particular application. So that's our new P for this application. Okay, so we're going to get into some results now. So this is sort of the big picture results for legacy phosphorus. So this is just the legacy phosphorus losses. This is not including the new phosphorus yet. And here I've combined both the surface losses and the tile losses from a given field. So each bar in this graph represents one field in our network. The axis here, the y-axis, is the annual DRP load. So on a yearly basis, this is how much phosphorus we see on average coming off these fields from legacy sources. And you'll see there's quite a bit of variability. Some of these fields is quite high, quite a large amount of legacy DRP. Some it's very low. On average, we see about 0.37 pounds of legacy P leaving these fields. Legacy DRP. Now, if we add the new phosphorus to these graphs, that's the orange bar here, we can see it bumps up for most of these fields. We do have some new DRP, but it's relatively small compared to the legacy DRP loss. There is quite a bit of variability. Some of these fields, the new DRP is a significant contribution, and some it's really minimal. But on average, if we combine both the legacy and the new DRP, this would be the total DRP loss from these fields. It's about 0.44 pounds per acre per year. Now we can look at this data on a percentage basis. So this is the percentage contribution of new DRP to the overall DRP load from each of these fields. Again, a lot of variability on this graph. You can see this one field really sticks out here. About 70% of the DRP coming off that field was new DRP from fertilizer applications. But for the most part, it's pretty low. A lot of these are below 10%. Almost all of them are below 30%. On average, we saw about 17% coming off those fields was new DRP from fertilizer applications. Now, if we look at total phosphorus, similar story. The legacy total phosphorus is the vast majority of this. A A lot of variability from field to field. On average, the total phosphorus from both sources was 1.2 pounds. The new total phosphorus here was about 11%. I don't have that on this, but it's about 11%, so less than for DRP. Okay, so that was sort of the big picture. Now I'd like to focus a little bit more just on the new DRP itself. So just looking at the orange portions of those bars from the last, so just the orange portions of these bars. We're just going to focus on that. And I'm going to split it out into individual P applications. So now each bar on this graph is representing one phosphorus application. So across our whole period of monitoring, we have about 100 applications that we caught in our monitoring program. Each bar here represents one of those applications. So it's the new DRP associated with that phosphorus application, okay? I'm not sure if anybody can see this, but I've also split these bars up into either the contribution from the tile discharge or the contribution from the surface discharge, but you probably won't be able to see that. Anyways, on the left-hand part of these graphs, we have, these are the chemical fertilizer applications. On the right-hand side, they're the manure applications. And really, the take-home I want from this graph is that the majority of these P applications, we really don't see any signal in the phosphorus, okay? So, you know, more than half, well over half of the chemical fertilizers and over half of the manure applications, we don't see any signal in the phosphorus, okay? There are a few of these where we see quite a bit, okay? So the natural question is, what's going on with those few? You know, those are obviously the problem ones. That's where we see more of this fertilizer-derived phosphorus coming out the field. So we can look at the characteristics of these different P applications and see if we can find any trends or patterns. So what I've done here is I grouped all those P applications from the last graph into different fertilizer form and placement categories. So I have 8 different categories here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to read these in the back, but the first bar here is chemical P. So this is anything that's not manure, essentially. Chemical P in solid form, so granular fertilizer, that was broadcast on the surface. Okay, the second category we have, again, chemical, solid, but this time it was incorporated. So after broadcasting, it was incorporated within 10 days. That was my cutoff, just an arbitrary cutoff I chose. Third category here is liquid P fertilizer, and that's injected. So these are essentially like starter fertilizer applications. The next category here, this big bar, is liquid manure that was broadcast on the surface, okay? Then we have liquid manure that was incorporated, liquid manure that was injected, solid manure that was broadcast, and solid manure that was incorporated. So that's all of our categories. Again, I've split these out by tile and surface, but you probably won't be able to tell, but that's okay. Really, the take home here is this liquid manure that's broadcast on the surface is a big problem. This is by far the largest source of new DRP. And this bar is solid, which means that most of that DRP is moving through the tile drains. There's very little coming over the surface from those applications. The numbers here, if you can read those, that's representing the number of applications we have in our record of that category. So for some of these, you know, it's a pretty small number, so you should take those with a grain of salt. Probably don't have a lot of confidence that that's always going to be the case if we only have 2 representations of that in our record. Okay, so that was DRP. I also have the total phosphorus on here. It's the same graph just for total phosphorus instead of DRP. I included this one because it's kind of interesting. If we look at this manure liquid that was incorporated, a large portion of this bar is coming from surface runoff. And this is really the only case where we saw a big increase in surface runoff due to incorporation. Surface TP, I should say, surface TP due to incorporation. The other categories with incorporation, we didn't really see that increase. So seems like sometimes, you know, there's this belief that incorporating, you're going to lead to greater erosion, greater total phosphorus losses. We see that maybe a little bit of that signal here, but it's not overwhelming in our data, at least. Okay, so another factor we can look at is the phosphorus application rate. So here I've made some plots with the rate on the horizontal x-axis, and again, this is the DRP load, the new DRP load on the y-axis. And really, we don't see any relationship between the amount of phosphorus applied in a given application and how much phosphorus came off of that field because of that application. Okay? The colors here they correlate to the same categories from the previous slide. But even if we split it out by different categories, there's no relationship there. So all this focus on phosphorus rate doesn't seem to have a big impact on at least within that first 3 months phosphorus losses due to that application. Okay, then the final factor we can sort of look at here is the timing of a phosphorus application. So on these graphs, I've just focused on the broadcast phosphorus applications. You know, we saw from a couple slides back that the broadcast applications seem to be the most problematic, especially of manure, liquid manure. So here I've grouped these broadcast applications into what month they occurred in. So we have April, March, May, June, August, September, October, November, December. And okay, so here on the left is DRP, on the right is our total phosphorus loss, new total phosphorus loss. And so what sticks out from this graph is you can see November and December tend to be a little bit more problematic, a little bit more risky, at least. That's when we tended to see the most new phosphorus coming off of those fields. Also here, May and June, you can see a little bit of an uptick. Looks like August, September, October, pretty safe. Not a lot of risk there. We haven't really seen any big increases in phosphorus because of applications during that time frame. Okay, so I just want to come back to the legacy P for a minute here. Focused a lot on the new P, but as we saw earlier, the legacy P is really what seems to be the major contributor. And so here I've graphed the legacy P here on the y-axis versus the STP, so soil test phosphorus. Each of these dots is representing one field in our network. And what we can see, you know, it seems like a pretty nice, good linear relationship there between as our STP goes up, the legacy DRP goes up pretty significantly. If we want to be a little bit critical of this, we can see that this line is really driven by these two fields that have very high soil test phosphorus. So we're talking above 300 ppm, Malic 3. So the question is, how representative of the actual landscape are these two fields? You know, maybe there's not very many fields out there that have STP in that range. So what we can do is we can basically ignore those two for now, and that's what I've done here. So I've basically excluded those two really high STP fields. And we can see there's still a positive relationship there. So clearly, soil test phosphorus does increase legacy P to some degree. But I also want to highlight the amount of scatter around this line. So, you know, STP is important, but it seems like it's definitely not the only factor driving legacy P losses. Okay, and if we think about it, we could maybe focus on these fields right here that tend to be below the line and see if, is there something about these fields where, even though they might have higher STP, the legacy losses don't seem to be as high as they are in some of the other fields. So if we could find some commonality about these particular fields, maybe we could leverage that to help address this issue of legacy losses. That's for the future, just an idea. I don't have any answers today for that. Okay, so a quick summary here of some of the initial findings from this analysis. We saw that losses of new phosphorus averaged 17% of the DRP coming from these fields. However, from individual fields, it was up to 70%. So, in certain situations, it does seem to be pretty important. And then total phosphorus is just 11% of the total phosphorus load. The riskiest applications seem to be broadcast liquid manure. Especially, we saw a lot of DRP moving through the tile drains due to those applications. So that's something we need to maybe think a little bit about how to handle those. And in terms of seasonality, the risk of new P loss from these applications, it seems like the riskiest time to do this is late fall or winter. Then spring, a little less risky, and then summer and fall seem to be the safest time periods to do these applications. We didn't see any relationship between the new P load and the phosphorus rate. I do want to highlight that this is just looking at the new P load, so it's not considering the long-term effects on soil test phosphorus of the rate of P being applied to these fields over a long time frame. But in the short term, there's really no relationship there between how much P is getting applied and how much P is coming off because of that application. And finally, legacy loss. It is related to STP, but there's other factors there, and that's something that requires further research. Okay, so some of these implications here. Basically, phosphorus fertilizer management, the 4 R's, it's going to have a limited impact. That's what this means. The impact of phosphorus fertilizer management is going to be limited because we're working within that relatively small sliver of total loads, all right? And the sort of corollary there is that we need more focus on these legacy phosphorus losses. So some of the things we could think about, we can draw down soil phosphorus, we know how to do that, but that's a long-term solution to the problem. It's not going to solve it in the next few years. Can we manage hydrology? Kevin's going to talk a little bit about drainage water management. Maybe other ideas for managing hydrology, trying to reduce the amount of water flowing through these systems. Does stratification of soil P have something to do with legacy losses? That's something we could look at. Capturing phosphorus at the field edge or downstream. We heard talks from Chad and who was our last speaker? Justin, yeah. And Justin about the feasibility of these. Maybe on those really hot spots, that might be a possibility. Okay, and that's what I have. I think we might have a little time for questions, but I do want to acknowledge all the people that help make this possible, people who do the work and the people who help fund the work, and take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes?
Mark? Could you provide a little more nuance to your definition of legacy phosphorus? And specifically, I'm looking for some kind of clarification on what could be thought of as phosphorus that was truly fertilizer applied and managed over, say, the last 20 years, and what might be considered a naturally occurring load from our fertile porous soil?
Yeah, that's a good question. Clearly, we have phosphorus naturally occurring in our soils. Off the top of my head, I'm afraid I don't have a great answer for that.
Do you think we ever will?
We can look at our natural systems. We could do some more work trying to measure phosphorus coming out of those. My guess is we're going to have pretty small losses relative to our agricultural systems. And if we think about legacy phosphorus, it's not really that important in terms of if it was there before we added it, or if we added it ourselves, or if it was there before we came into the system, because, you know, it's there regardless of who put it on. It's there, it's in the system, it's going to be interacting, it's going to be acting as a source of phosphorus. So, you know, we like to blame people and point fingers, but I think maybe we should just think about what's there and what the problem is and what the solutions are, rather than worrying about who's to blame for it. So,
I think I saw another hand. Go ahead.
yep.
Interested to hear your suggestions for the phosphorus stratification. You mentioned that as being one of the things you need to look at for the legacy feed, because that seems to be, the legacy feed seems to be the major thing that we should focus on, I guess.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was, do I have any thoughts about managing phosphorus stratification and how that might relate to legacy losses? So, yeah, the idea there is that if you have a highly stratified system, so the phosphorus is very concentrated in the top surface couple inches of your soil, you'll have greater interaction of that phosphorus with water and potentially greater losses of that phosphorus. So if we could reduce that stratification either through tillage or potentially through subsurface placement of phosphorus to even out the phosphorus in the profile, that might help reduce the risk of phosphorus loss, because you'd have less direct interaction between runoff and the highly concentrated surface.
So what kind of tillage are you proposing? Because in my review of the cropping practices here, I saw that basically the farmers are no-tilling soybeans, but they're plowing corn before corn. So every year, 2 years, it's already being tilled with chisel plows and discing probably. So I don't think any reduced tillage is not going to do it, because they are already doing it every other year. So are you proposing then that the farmers are going to mow or plow the fields to address this issue?
I wouldn't say I'm proposing anything. Again, I think this is an avenue for future research, but you know, maybe we need to look at the possibility of having someone come in and doing some inversion once every 5 or 10 years, just to handle that stratification. I don't know. There hasn't been anything done on that, but I think there's potential there that it could be effective. And if you're only doing it once every 10 years, maybe the effects on soil quality wouldn't be too damaging.